Well, 2020 is a big year in the life of our church. 2020, we will celebrate our 150-year celebration. 1870 to 2020 this year. We're going to celebrate in May. We're going to have, I believe in May, we're going to have a big time of fellowship. You're going to hear a lot about this. The 150-year celebration, anybody know what that's called? Sesquicentennial, right? And you're like, I don't know how to pronounce that. Well, I gave you the phonetical, how to say it, sesquicentennial. If somebody doesn't make a t-shirt that says this on there for us this year, I'm going to be disappointed. A few months ago, I was challenged a couple of guys I'm in a group text with that began to think about like things that were going on when this church started, right? So here's a couple of things. You know what happened in April 15th, 1865 at the Peterson House in Washington, D.C.? Lincoln died. 5 years before this church was established, Lincoln died. So I begin to think, there are people who helped start Friendship Baptist and now Second Baptist who founded this, who possibly voted for Lincoln to be the president of the United States. Do you know what happened during these dates? June 19, 1834 to June 31st, 1892. Who was alive during this time? Back row? Spurgeon. Spurgeon was in. This church, when this started, Spurgeon was literally pastoring and preaching when this church started. So begin to think about all these historical things. Here's some other stuff that happened when the year this church was founded. On February 3rd, 1870, the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which gave the right to vote to black males, became law when the required number of states ratified it. So the year that this church started is the year that the 15th Amendment was ratified in the Constitution. Keep going. On October 12, 1870, Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general of the Civil War, died at the age of 63 in Lexington, Virginia, the same year that this church started. Keep going. You know who these guys are? Say it. The Wright brothers, right? This is the Wright brothers. Orville and Wilbur. And I don't know which is which. I'm thinking this is Orville and this is Wilbur. Do you know that Wilbur wasn't even born when this church was started, and Wilbur, Orville, his older brother, was just 2 years old? So I'm reading about all this historical things that happened in 1870, and like this world was completely different. No airplanes, no automobiles. Lincoln had just been assassinated, like on the heels of the Civil War ending, like all of these things. And since then, think about all the events that have taken place in our country. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, baby boomers, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Air Force Base being placed here. I mean, all of these things have happened since this church was founded. And so we're going to celebrate 1870 to 2020, 150 years. I was thinking about this the last few weeks. Like, for 150 years, the Lord has been faithful in providing for this church. When they were up on the road in Quincy Hill, and the church was over there, and some of you guys were even part of that, even in those earlier Friendship Baptist. And then it moves to this location, and then the place next door to us, the original sanctuary was built, and then this place was added on in different sections, and all of these things taking place. And I think it's important for us as a church to go back and celebrate 150 years. I think it's important for us to go back and think about all the ways in which God has blessed and cared for and ministered to this church and the way that He has provided in unimaginable ways. So I was thinking about that, and I was drawn back to the Old Testament, 2 Kings chapter 2, to a passage of Scripture that is probably familiar, this Elijah and Elisha. Elijah's passing and Elisha becoming the mantle being passed on to him. And so I want us to just take our time together this morning, 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 15, and walk through these verses together. And simply for our time together today, 2 points. First, remember yesterday, and 2, prepare for tomorrow. 1, remember yesterday. 2, prepare for tomorrow. First, let's take the first 6 verses and just walk through this text as Elijah and Elisha are remembering yesterday. 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 1. The time had come for the Lord to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elijah and Elisha were traveling from Gilgal. Okay, hang on. So what you're going to see in the next 6 verses is Elijah and Elisha go to 4 different places, 4 different cities and markers and events that took place in the nation of Israel. The first one they have here is they find themselves at Gilgal. Now, Gilgal was the city that the nation of Israel camped at first when they crossed over the Jordan River. If you remember in Joshua chapter 4, the nation of Israel, they get across the Jordan, and then God says, I want you to take 12 stones, and I want you to set these stones up as a mark of remembrance, that you remember the faithfulness of God and how He led you from Egypt in the 40 years of the wilderness across the Jordan into the promised land. And so just remember this time of the nation of Israel. In fact, Joshua chapter 4 says this: the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped at Gilgal on the eastern limits of Jericho. Then Joshua set up in Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken from the Jordan. And he said to the Israelites, in the future, when your children ask their fathers, what is the meaning of these stones? Listen, you should tell your children, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the water on the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, just as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which He dried up before us until we crossed over. Verse 24. This is so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord's hand is mighty, and so that you may always fear the Lord your God. And so Elijah and Elisha find themselves at Gilgal. And this is an important place in the nation and life of Israel. As they crossed over the Jordan, they set these stones up as a mark of remembrance. And God says to the nation of Israel, when you see these stones set up and the people, families come by, as they walk by, you're to say this: God was faithful in delivering us from the Egyptians into this promised land, that He crossed over the Red Sea and crossed over the Jordan into dry land, in the faithfulness of God. Surely we could stand and tell stories of the faithfulness of God over the last 150 years of this church. Surely there are markers that we could go to. Every Sunday morning when I walk to the back and shake hands, I see that plaque to the left of the door out there, and I see the names of fathers and family members of people within this church. And I remember the story of how this church wanted to build a sanctuary, and they didn't have the money to do it. And so they gathered together. Bill Harden and I were talking about this just a few weeks ago. They went to the place, and the guy said, I looked at your books. There's no way I can lend you any money. I'm not going to lend you any money. He said, but I've never known a Southern Baptist church to default on a loan. So the bank gave them their money. The deacons signed their name to it. And God, in provision for that, never defaulted on the loan. And they were able to continue to build and expand their footprint in this community. So we could tell story after story, and we will hear stories over the next few months. How God has faithfully taken this congregation to another place and to a different place. And for 150 years, as leaders came and leaders went, as people were born and people passed away, as the world around us changed, this faithfulness of God. And so here's Elijah and Elisha. And Elijah's telling him, man, you remember this spot and the faithfulness of God. And we crossed over the Jordan onto dry ground. The text goes on in verse 2. And Elijah said to Elisha, stay here. The Lord is sending me on to Bethel. But Elisha replied, as the Lord lives and you yourself live, underline this, I will not leave you. Elisha knew that Elijah's days were numbered, that his time was coming for his taking to be taken away. And Elisha looked at Elijah and said, I'm not leaving you. As the Lord lives and it gives me opportunity, I'm staying with you. So where you go, I'll go. And so they went down to Bethel. You know what happened at Bethel? A couple of places and things that happened in Bethel. You remember Jacob? Jacob wrestled with an angel. Do you remember that story? If you go back in Genesis and Jacob, he had just crossed and saw that he was about to interact with Esau. And Jacob, remember what he had done to Esau. And so they get to this point, and Jacob, if you go back and read the story in Genesis, Jacob is scared to death. He takes his family, divides him in two. He's scared about what's going to happen when I come across Esau in the coming days. And Jacob goes to sleep that night, and he's scared. I don't know how this is going to work out. I don't know what's going to happen. And he has this wrestling match. This angel, he's, let me go. And the angel's, and there's this moment here. The angel changes his name from Jacob to Israel. The next day, Jacob and Esau meet, and Jacob and Esau embrace each other. I thought about that story, and I thought, what about this church? wonder if we could look back in our history and see moments and times, listen, where this church said, I don't know how, I'm scared. I don't know how we're going to make it through this season. I don't know how we're going to make it through this time. I don't know how we're going to make it onto this next, I don't know how we're going to press through this issue. And this congregation for 150 years has huddled up together, and God has come alongside of them and blessed them and protected them and provided for them. 150 years of a church ministering to the city of Jacksonville and to the state of Arkansas and to America and to the world. And I wonder how many stories we could tell of this church in times like Bethel. It was just concern about what's going to happen, how's this going to work out, and the faithfulness of God and how God's provided for them. Also, Bethel was a main place of worship for the nation of Israel. It's a place where the nation of Israel would come and they would have their times of worship and celebration. It was a very special place in the life of the nation of Israel. And so Elijah and Elisha end up there in this place. Verse 3. Then the sons of the prophet who were at Bethel came out to Elijah and said, do you know that the Lord will take your master away from you today? And he said, and I think this is a very polite version of what he said. Yeah, I know that. Be quiet, right? Elijah said to him, Elisha, stay here. The Lord is sending me to Jericho. But Elisha said, as the Lord lives and as you yourselves live, I will not leave you. So they went to Jericho. We know what happened at Jericho. The nation of Israel is in the promised land. They've crossed over, and now they're heading into battle. Joshua is leading them. Joshua's ready. And in my mind, I can just picture the story. Joshua's like, let's take this city. Let's do this. We got this. Everybody's together. Joshua comes in. You know, he's been lifting, jacked up, shirt, sleeves cut off. He's like, we're going to take this city. And God's like, hang on. Where's the music guy? And Joshua's like, what? Yeah, God says, we're not going to use people and fight. We're going to use the band. And the band is going to walk all the way around this city 7 times for the next 7 days. And Joshua's like, what? No, let's go to battle. And God's like, no. Let's have this people, as they lead this procession around the city, and say nothing. And on the 7th day, walk around for 7 times. And Elijah are standing there, and I can imagine them talking about how on the 7th day, on the 7th time, they blew the horns and the walls collapsed. And God fought the battle for them. That God has provided for them and blessed them and protected them. And that Elijah and Elisha are having this time of remembrance of the past and the faithfulness of God in their lives. And they press on from Jericho and they get down to Jordan, verse 5. And the sons of the prophets who were in Jericho came up to Elisha and said, do you know that the Lord your master will be taken away from you today? And he said, yeah, I know, be quiet. And Elijah said to him, stay here. The Lord is sending me to the Jordan. But Elisha said, as the Lord lives and as you live yourself, I will not leave you. So the two of them went to Jordan, the place where the nation of Israel walked across on dry land. There's value, church, regardless of your age. There's value in looking and remembering back to yesterday. It's important. Many of you did that over the last few weeks. You sat around with your family at a dinner table or in a living room, and you talked about when this person was young, you would do this. And remember when mom was here and we would do this, and you would reflect back on yesterday. And there is importance for us to do that as a church. And we want to do that as a church, to look back on moments that we've experienced the faithfulness of God and the provisions of God and the protections of God and how God's led and moved and done miraculous things in the life of this church, is overabundantly blessed in the life of this church. As Elijah and Elisha are kind of looking back, there's this remembrance of yesterday. But just as important it is to remember yesterday, this is also equally important to prepare for tomorrow. Verse 7. 50 men from the sons of the prophets came and stood observing them at a distance, while the two of them stood by the Jordan. Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, struck the water, which parted on the right and left, and the two of them walked across on dry land. So Elijah takes off his mantle, this piece of cloth, and he hits the water and the Jordan splits. Now, remember that. And they walk across dry land. And then Elijah asked Elisha a question that I want you to highlight in your Bible, and it's this. When they crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, tell me what I can do for you before I'm taken from you. The older Elijah says to the younger Elisha, what can I do for you before my time is up? Before I'm taken away, before God takes me home, what can I do for you? You know, something happens when you guys become grandparents, right? I'm not quite there yet, but I will. I have 4 kids, and one day, hopefully, we'll have grandkids. But I take my kids to my parents' house, and y'all, I don't ever remember walking into Philip and Cindy Odell's house and $20 bills just start pouring out because I walk through the door. I'm like, where is this? When we go over to their house, my mom's got tri-tip cooked, mashed potatoes. She's got macaroni and cheese, green beans, 4-layer salad, 4-layer delight. We've got pistachio pudding. We've got homemade cookies, homemade brownies, homemade everything. And I'm looking at them like, when I was growing up, when I came home, it was salmon patties, white gravy, and a can of corn, right? I mean, what is all of this stuff that you're making for these people? I'm convinced that my kids could go to my mom and ask them to go somewhere, and my mom would be like, let's load up. They could look at my dad in the eye and say, Paul, we'd really like to have this. And my dad would say, go get in the truck, let's go get it. I'm like, what? I had to wait till Christmas. My birthday was at Thanksgiving, and then Christmas. For birthday, I got socks, and for Christmas, I got pants, because that's what I needed, right? And you guys are getting all these hoverboards and everything. This never happened when I was a kid. And I've watched some of you do this to your grandchildren and hear from your kids. But something happens when you become a grandparent. And you know why my mom and dad, Paul and Gigi, do that for my kids and my sister's kids? It's because they love them. They love them deeply. And I've thought about that over Christmas, and I thought, what if that translated into our churches? Where people would turn to the next generation and say, what can I do for you? What do you need? Before my time, before I'm taken, before I go to be with the Lord, what do you need? What can I do for you? And it doesn't matter what generation you're a part of. Whether you're in the builder generation or you're in the millennial generation, whether you're the boomer or you're Gen X, Gen Y, or wherever you are, I think there should always be a posture of heart within our families and in our churches that we look to the generation coming up behind us and ask this simple question: what do you need? What do you need? And this church has a history of doing that. We have one of the best children areas and preschool areas in the entire county. Churches come here and look for what we've done in our children's area. We have a phenomenal student area. But what happens when that becomes the posture of our church? That yes, we reflect on yesteryears. Yes, we reflect on the faithfulness of God at Gilgal and Bethel and Jordan and all of these places. We look back on how God has moved in a miraculous way at Second Baptist Jacksonville. But what if then our posture turned to our generation coming up behind us and said this: what can I do for you? What do you need? When my time's up and I'm not here, what do you need so that you can succeed in the ministry that is continuing on in the life of this church? What do you need? What can I do? What can I give? Do you need me to teach? I'll teach. Do you need me to invest in? I'll invest in. Do you need me to go somewhere? I'll go somewhere. But tell me what I need to do, because my time is coming. Before I'm taken from you, you tell me what I can do for you. Tell me what I can be for you. Tell me what I can pray for you. Tell me where I can be for you in your ministry and your life. And then that becomes the posture of the church. Where yes, we look back on 150 years of the faithfulness of God, but we prepare for tomorrow, because here's the reality, church. There's going to come a day where we won't be here. There's going to come a day where this church, Second Baptist Church, will have an entire celebration, and not a single one of us will be there to celebrate it. There'll come a day when this church and the faithfulness of God, Jesus says, this is my church and I will build this church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Paul said to the church in Philippians, I am convinced that he who began a good work in you will complete it until that day. And I believe in my heart that what God started 150 years ago at Friendship Baptist, Second Baptist, he's not done with yet, and will complete it when the day Christ returns. And until that day comes, should we not all collectively say to those people behind us, what can I do for you? What do you need? What an incredible question. Elijah could have stood there and looked at Elisha and said, man, I'm praying, my time's gone. Good luck. not going to be here anymore. But he looked at the next guy in line. He looked at Elijah and said this, what do you need? What can I do for you? What an incredible question to ask. And Elisha's response is equally incredible. Let me inherit 2 shares of your spirit. Now, just come real close to this. Elisha said this, listen, he said, I've listened to the faithfulness of God, how he provided for you in Bethel, and I provided for you in Gilgal, and how he took care of you in Jordan, and how he blessed you in this area of your life. But I've watched the faithfulness of God. I've heard the stories. I've seen the celebrations. Elijah, as you leave, I want double what you've experienced. And so for us and the generations coming up, those in our children's ministry and youth ministry, young adult ministry, as we move up in leadership and in our involvement in the church, that our response would be, we don't want more stuff, we want more of God. We don't want more things. We want to experience what you've experienced. We want to take steps of faith like you've taken steps of faith. We want to move out and do the things that you've done in your life. And Elisha looks at Elijah and says, I want double of the Spirit in my life. What a remarkable moment, church. I don't worry about what you're having for lunch or the Saints play at 12:05. Here's what you're going to think about. What do you want? What can I do for you? I want 2 shares of your spirit. I want double portion. I've watched God hand on you. I've watched God move and how you've taken steps of faith. Now he's provided for you. And I want to experience that. Going to the text. Verse 10. Elijah replied, you've asked for something difficult. If you see me being taken from you, you will have it. If not, you won't. Verse 11, as they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire with horses of fire suddenly appeared and separated the 2 of them. And Elijah went up into heaven in the whirlwind. Verse 12, as Elisha watched, he kept crying out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. It's broken. Elisha is broken. Elijah is no longer there. Just in the few years that I've been your pastor, we have said our goodbyes to some incredibly great men. I have watched the landscape of this church change as men who were faithfully serving the Lord are not with us. This coming Wednesday, we will gather in this room and we will say our goodbyes to my friend and a man who's meant so much to this church, Bill Harden. And he's broken. Verse 13. I'm sorry. Verse 12, the end of it. When he could see him no longer, he took a hold of his own cloths, tore them in 2. Verse 13, I'm almost done. He picked up the mantle that had fallen off of Elijah. He went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. So Elisha bends down and he's holding it in his hands. Now, jump into this story. He walks to the bank of the Jordan. He took the mantle Elijah had dropped and he struck the water. And he said, where is the Lord God of Elijah? He asked. He struck the water himself, and it departed to the right and the left This is incredible. And Elijah crossed over. Do you know what happened? The very last miracle that Elijah did is the very first miracle that Elisha does. The Spirit had been passed to him. When the sons of the prophets from Jericho who were observing saw him, they said, "The Spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." They came to meet him and bowed down to the ground in front of him. Here's the reality, church. The same Spirit in God who led the nation of Israel across the Jordan, who rests on Elijah, is the same God that rests in the mantle and the shoulders of Elisha. And the same Spirit that was there and God that was there in that moment is the same Spirit and God that led this church to plant itself 150 years ago on the city of Jacksonville. And that same Spirit and that same God has led this church for 150 years, faithfully leading them and providing for them in incredible ways. And that same Spirit and the same God that was there with Elijah and Elisha, that was there 150 years ago, is in this room today and in our hearts. And as we press forward, the same Spirit that led Elijah and Elisha and 150 years ago will lead us on in serving and ministering to the city of Jacksonville, the state of Arkansas, America, and the world with the gospel. And so, yes, you remember yesterday, but you prepare for tomorrow. What do you want? I want double portion. This year, we're going to do something that I've never done before in my life. Spent a few weeks ago just wrestling in my heart for us in 2020, praying, like, God, what do you want for us? And my heart just became heavy as I began to think, like, what if we committed 2020 as a church and said, we're going to celebrate 150 years, but what's in the hallways of our hearts and everything that we're doing are these words: to God be the glory. What if every time we met in this room, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday nights, that our prayer was, God, we want you to be glorified. When our youth met, to God be the glory. To our children, to God be the glory. In our preschool, to God be the glory. In our adults, in our senior adults, to God be the glory. What if every song we sang and the posture of the choir and Jonathan was, to God be the glory? What if every mission trip we went on, every vacation Bible school we're a part of, every group that we sent to St. Louis or Guatemala or Luther, wherever else we go this year, that our heartbeat, that our drive and what drives us in our celebration is that God receive the glory. And so we're going to launch this year a one-year thing where we just cried out to the Lord and say, God, to you and you alone be the glory. We want a double portion of the blessings and the Spirit that they've celebrated in years past. And we're going to cry out to you that in our families, in our marriages, in our homes, in our Sunday school teachers, in our relationships, in our community, in our deacons, in our choir, in our staff, in whatever we do, to God and God alone be the glory. And I go back to Psalms chapter 75. It's at the beginning, where the psalmist says these words: who do I have in heaven but you? And there is nothing this earth has that I would want. Who do I have in heaven but you? And I desire nothing on earth but